There are a lot of games out there that offer a plethora of options for the player to make progress. Different weapons, different armor, different attack abilities or skills, different team members, different buffs, different spells, and even stat respecking. They're all there to give you a way to press forward and achieve victory. You mix and match and eventually you reach a playstyle that suits your needs and still manages to keep things fun. But, specifically, I'm talking to those who find enjoyment in seeking out the most busted and challenge-defeating methods they can possibly find. The ones who play around and experiment with every tool and resource the game offers, for the sole purpose of discovering and utilizing the strongest in order to be as efficient as possible, trivializing obstacles or, in some cases, other players. I do this on occasion too. Sometimes it's just fun rampaging through a game knowing that damn near nothing can stop you, and there's an extra sense of fulfillment if you found these strategies through your own experimentation. But not everyone feels so happy for you. You might receive a visceral negative reaction from others, fervent disapproval at your willingness to, quote, abuse mechanics or systems just to finish the mission or to get the win, especially if you're playing a game known for its challenge or high difficulty. Worst case, you might even get accusations of cheating thrown your way, but you're not cheating, because you're not doing anything outside of what the game developers intended for you to access. You're simply using the same tools, skills, and resources the game itself provides equally to everyone, but in the most optimal manner you've decided that suits your playstyle or gets the best results. That's it. You're not a cheater, you're just pragmatic. Now, to alleviate any potential confusion, let me explain what I mean when I use the word pragmatic in this context. I'm referring to people who are practical in their efforts to complete a goal, finding and using the strongest and most efficient means to an end. They know what tools work the best, they use them, and they don't constrain themselves to following rules that don't actually exist, especially the arbitrary house rules spouted by random people online, which are not the same as purposeful limitations imposed by the game itself. This might come as a shock to some of you, but pragmatism in games, either single-player or multiplayer, is not often met with praise. As I mentioned, it may end up causing cheating accusations to be hurled, even though no real cheating is taking place. Everyone has the same access to the same resources, but pragmatic players typically seek the shortest route to victory using those resources, in spite of any challenge the game may seek to pose. If there's any gray area to be discussed here, it's probably the exploitation of glitches and bugs. But honestly, in single-player games only, I'm cool with it. Typically, a person wouldn't take advantage of those in a first playthrough of a game they're enjoying anyway, so once they're done with the game, they can go back and abuse the hell out of them. Why not? Either way, no one's holding a gun to your head and forcing you to use exploits or avoid them. I'm a firm believer that a person should be able to play a game however they wish within the boundaries of the game. And I want to offer my own defense for this pragmatic approach to playing. First, there's single-player games. Pragmatism and its detractors usually rears its head in RPGs where build variety is fairly heavy, or combat-focused games with lots of depth, or at least multiple ways to approach a fight, and especially when the game takes pride in difficulty. In games such as these, there's inevitably a manner in which you can defeat most enemies thrown your way with marked ease. Broken strategies that practically trivialize what are supposed to be the greatest challenges. Some people gleefully take advantage of these tactics, because more often than not, they're still pretty damn fun to do. Others, however, sidestep them, preferring to maintain the sense of difficulty, usually out of personal preference, though some believe it's what the developers truly intended for all players to experience. Generally speaking, I think most people ultimately don't mind, one way or another, what strategy others use. After all, it's still a single-player game. But sometimes you might hear, depending on the community, criticisms of those who take the easy route to achieve victory. An argument of the fulfillment of overcoming great obstacles may ensue, as well as assumptions of the developer's intent. but it's not up to you to decide what level of fulfillment a person should experience when playing a certain way. And what if it is intended by the developer to allow the player to win by any means necessary? It's not always about reaction time or combo memorization or tediously rote learning. Sometimes it's all about the strategy itself, and refining one enough to reach the point where you can get through the game with ease. Some people simply get the most fun out of finding ways to break a game that offers so many different options. The best example I can probably give that most viewers are likely to understand is the Dark Souls series, including and especially its recent spiritual successor, Elden Ring. Probably an overplayed and belabored point to many by now, I know, but these games cover a huge amount of what I wish to discuss in relation to this topic, so I will be talking about this genre at length. It's no secret whatsoever that each game in this franchise contains at least one build, spell, weapon, etc. that makes the game much easier. Typically, magic is the main perpetrator, dating all the way back to Demon's Souls, where the use of sorcery was considered easy mode. And honestly, I can understand why. I enjoy running magic-centric glass cannon builds in that game, both the original and the remake. Why? Well, because I think it's fun. In Elden Ring, some of the most commonly relied upon broken or OP strategies involve proccing bleed or frost on your enemies over and over for massive damage stacking. And before balance patches came out, people were spamming Hoarfrost Stomp and grabbing the Sword of Night and Flame or Moonveil or Rivers of Blood, all of which can easily shred most foes, trash mobs, bosses, and anyone in between, and the former three could be acquired very easily. Some of you listening might rebut that these tools have since been nerfed, and that is true, but in many cases, the weapons and ashes of war affected by these changes are not necessarily made weak. They're simply made less strong, so that they're not so ridiculously overwhelming that you would be a fool to not use them. A good portion of the nerfed tools are still at or near the top of the food chain. It's just that the gap between them and everything else isn't so egregious anymore, which is proper balancing. Besides those, very strong weapons and ashes still exist in the game, and some of the latter are viable on every build, on almost every weapon, from the beginning to the end of the game, like Storm Stomp. And then you have something like Endure, which increases poise. Slap it on a dagger in your right hand while holding a catalyst in your left, and now you can cast magic with poise really quickly and easily, securing casts of spells with long startups for free. Every spellcaster should have one Endure dagger on them as a just-in-case. There's also Bestial Sling, an incantation with low requirements that's worth using for any build simply as a get-away-from-me move that can be used both offensively and defensively. There's also strong NPC summons, called Spirit Ashes, available early as well, such as Ludel the Headless and Banished Knight Oleg. Some of them can carry or at least tank entire boss fights by themselves if you level them up enough too, such as Mimic Tear or Black Knife Tiche. You're not forced to use any of these things if you truly don't want to, but they are there, and they're effective, and for many, they are fun to use. I know the game is meant to be challenging to an extent, but I feel that the process of experimentation and discovery of any particular builds or tools' strengths is part of that journey. In fact, the creator of the Souls series and co-director of Elden Ring, Hidetaka Miyazaki, more or less feels the same. In an interview with Wired sometime around the launch of Dark Souls 3, he made a few statements regarding difficulty and builds. Ever since Demon's Souls, I've really been pursuing making games that give players a sense of accomplishment by overcoming tremendous odds. We've added new items and weapons over the course of the series, and having a certain level of difficulty adds value to those because they incentivize players to experiment more with character builds and weapon loadouts. The interviewer follows up by asking if some builds are underpowered on purpose. Miyazaki responds, "It really does depend on the classes. They can drastically impact the overall difficulty of the game. I want players to consider how to complete each stage using each class. utilizing their strengths and weaknesses. There are different approaches in both your route through certain areas of the game and how you maximize the attributes of each class. Going even further back, there's another interview in 2011 for Dark Souls, where Miyazaki is asked by Sony's Sid Schumann how the team prevents the game from being difficult to the point of driving players to quit. Miyazaki gives a detailed reply. Good question. We can't tell you all of our secrets, but there are a few ways we prevent users from drifting away. Number 1, the difficulty is not dependent on the skill level of the user. We have not created a game where players who react faster or press buttons faster fare better than others. Second, when a player dies, we try to leave a sense of, maybe if I try a different strategy, I can succeed. Things that you lose in death can be outweighed by what you gain by trying again. We try to give players lots of freedom to design their own gameplay style, and we've implemented enough content to enable users to continue challenging themselves and continue making progress. It might come as a shock to some people to know that Miyazaki himself says Dark Souls is not skill-based, but it's true. The difficulty of Dark Souls is not, nor has it ever been, intended to be about who has the fastest reflexes. It's always been about patience and the effectiveness of one's strategy. It's always been possible to utterly break every Souls game with the right tools, and Elden Ring has made this more obvious than ever, even after all the nerfs to the strongest weapons, ashes, and spells. Miyazaki may have designed his games to be challenging, yes, but he also designed them to allow or even encourage pragmatic combat decisions. If a strategy isn't working, move to one that does, and keep refining it as best you can. It's not cheap, it's not cheating, it's a purposefully made perk of the game's core design, and emblematic of having meaningful choice in character development. You can make your own difficulty. Options are good. They give us reason to replay a game until we've felt we've done everything it has to offer. A sign of strong replayability in games like this is when you see different players using different builds, and it's like they're playing a different game entirely as a result. As I've mentioned with things like pre-nerf Hoarfrost and Moonveil, there are some cases where weapons and spells boast colossal strength and allow for players to reach godlike levels of power with little effort. But regardless of whether they are or aren't rebalanced in updates, as some were in later patches, they're often just part of the magic of character development, given to the player as rewards for accomplishing a milestone in story progression or traveling far off the beaten path to explore in dangerous territory. Elden Ring has shown immense encouragement, arguably forcefulness, in pointing the player away from soul-crushing challenges so they can come back later and decimate bosses that used to be walls. Margit the Fell Omen is a perfect example of this. When the game first launched, I saw so many people online express frustration at this fight, and I understand why, because I also rushed to it thinking that I could handle it, and I couldn't. Convinced after several doomed attempts where I could barely get him down to half health, I figured I was underleveled and undergeared, so I went elsewhere. I upgraded my weapon a few times, got a couple new pieces of armor, and put some points into vigor, and leveled up my Lone Wolf Ashes a bit too. And guess what? Those several tiny differences stacked up to give me a huge edge on the next fight, and Margit became an absolute chump. I beat him on the first try after returning. It showed me that he wasn't really a wall, he was just a level and equipment check to stop players from bum rushing through the main progression path, and make them consider going into those dungeons and caves they've been passing by. Some might see it as pitiable cheesing, but practically nuking Margit with leveled up lone wolves and a bleed weapon is a valid strategy the game does not stop you from doing. Plus, it's just fun. Under most circumstances, it would be bad for a developer to just start dismantling and forbidding strong but unproblematic builds just because they wish to shoehorn players into specific playstyles, as if players are only allowed to use their freedom within a designated limit. And those players may, rightfully, interpret such aggressive post-launch rebalancing as attempts by the devs to force the experience they envision on people by nerfing resources into obscurity or uselessness, thus taking away viable options that they were already enjoying. This creates an uninteresting and bland level of uniformity where it feels like completely different builds don't impact gameplay all that much. You feel like you may as well just stick to whatever you start with because it'll be just as effective as anything else you find, even in endgame content. And that's just not fun. People who use pragmatic builds in hopes of trivializing the difficulty are more or less inevitable in a lot of games, especially RPGs, and that's a fact that developers should keep in mind and accept. Trying too hard to deter or control them with arbitrary limitations might end up doing more harm than good to the game's overall design. To reiterate, I have nothing against anyone who refuses to play with the strongest tools or resources. It's all personal preference. Dark Souls has a lot of potential for very entertaining challenge runs where the player purposefully ramps up the difficulty for their own amusement. I do those on occasion as well. However, discouraging other players from learning how to use these powerful strategies while insisting that their utilization is not what the developer wanted is not really true. Everyone is provided equal opportunity to use the same tools in the same game. You can choose to play a totally busted build just as easily as someone else can choose to play a naked, fists-only soul level 1 character. Players may deviate at numerous points down the line of character progression, choosing to implement or ignore these tools based on their own desired playstyle, but we're all still playing the same game in the end. And it goes without saying, this train of thought doesn't apply to just Souls games. It goes for every game that offers many ways to play. If I were to sum up my own personal feelings on the subject, I simply think that if the game allows you to do it, then it's open season. And when I say allow, I mean using in-game weapons, tools, and resources without the usage of third-party cheats or hacks. If it's inside the game and accessible without third-party applications needing to break in, then it's fair game. Trying to force another player to experience a game based on your own arbitrary rules and criteria for what a legitimate playstyle is practically antithetical to the entire appeal of these types of video games. They are meant to let a player explore and create their own fun, whether that means trivializing its biggest challenges with the most ruthlessly practical tactics, or deliberately gimping themselves to raise the stakes. If the game allows it, then anyone, is entitled to play that way if they wish. This is similarly applied to multiplayer games as well. Granted, when we cross the barrier from player versus environment to player versus player, then a few small contextual details of this discussion are changed, and things get a little bit stricter. For now, let's continue with relating it to Souls games, since we're already talking about them. Don't worry, I will touch on other games soon. A big thing in the Souls games and their community is PvP, namely in the forms of invasions and dueling. For a while, mostly during the window between the releases of Dark Souls 1 and 2, where the latter finally had arenas that allowed fights outside of invasions, there was a lot of debate over the nature of invading other people's games. Are invasions technically duels? Is the invader owed civility or fair play from the host? Is it unfair for the host to heal themselves whenever they're invaded? Frankly, I feel like the answer to all of these questions is no. Invasions are an inherently malicious mechanic. A person forces themselves into the world of another player non-consensually, with the singular purpose of killing them for a reward of some kind. Any other rule added onto that by an individual player is totally arbitrary and ultimately superfluous. Duels are duels because they're consensual on the part of both participants. Invasions are not. Therefore, the host is allowed, arguably obligated, to eliminate the invader by any means necessary. They don't have to humor their enemy with formalities. The host's end goal is to just get rid of them. Nothing more, nothing less. If the host wishes to play patiently, run away, throw items, play dirty, or even just chuck themselves off the nearest cliff to force the invader out, that's their own prerogative, and they are entitled to do that. They're all options provided by the game itself. And if we were to get into a discussion about developer intent yet again, Miyazaki has even more to say on the subject of invasions. Way back in 2009 with Japanese magazine Famitsu when discussing the mechanic in Demon's Souls. Indeed, my vision of an invasion wasn't to introduce player killing. It's more akin to a strong enemy being controlled by a human. That's the vision I wanted to achieve. If there wasn't the system message pop-up that said a dark spirit has invaded, the gameplay experience should be similar to an offline single-player game with a very strong enemy popping up randomly. They don't speak, it could perhaps be a very smart AI. That was the vision. What I wanted to create was not a PvP match, but fearsome enemies roaming in the world, and each person roleplays as if they were a notorious predator. What I wanted to achieve is an environment where it encourages roleplay for players to be enemies against one another. So to answer your question, player killing was not our intent when introducing this mechanic. Straight from the horse's mouth, Miyazaki himself states that invaders are not meant to pose that much of a threat to begin with. They're more akin to a particularly strong trash mob than they are to some godlike boss. Basically, invaders are, by design, starting at the beginning of the franchise, meant to be at some sort of disadvantage. This is made more apparent than ever in Elden Ring too, since you can only invade a host who is co-oping, meaning the invader is automatically destined to face multiple enemies at once. Beyond invasions, however, Souls games still do have actual duels. In Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, true duels basically existed through consensual invasions, and both participants agreed to rules beforehand. But starting with 2, there were many more official means of having an honorable duel, including more and better arenas and different types of summon signs. This leads us into a subtopic relating to games that are much more competitive in nature: the meta. In competitive multiplayer games, the meta is essentially the game outside the game. It's a more theoretical aspect of competition, where players weigh the strengths and weaknesses of their choice in characters, weapons, and loadouts against the strengths and weaknesses of their opponents. It ultimately boils down to a huge portion of the player base deciding to use the strongest available strategies and resources, those of which that have the least amount of weaknesses and boast high effectiveness against other strategies. Players who understand and take advantage of a game's meta are typically put in a more favorable position over those who don't, but it still always comes down to individual skill, as knowledge of a meta doesn't necessarily mean you have the skill to apply that knowledge effectively. If a game has an established meta, it becomes expected of a player to use it, because refusal to do so automatically puts them at a disadvantage unless they have the skill to make up for it, which may be very difficult. This is a form of competitive pragmatism. You're using the tried and true best options available to secure a win. Of course, on rare occasions, some powerful meta strategies or resources are also very forgiving towards low executional skill, which throws a game's entire balance out of whack. But a competent developer will correct that fairly quickly. Let's take this opportunity to bring other types of games into this discussion, specifically fighting games. Fighting games have been around for a long time. They're arguably the first truly competitive multiplayer games ever, which means the genre is no stranger to the concept of metas. Fighting games have a meta of their own, typically in the form of tiers. Of course, tier lists are often very subjective and arbitrary in themselves, because they tend to reflect only the experience of the list creator, and does not cover every matchup at the same level of skill across every region of the world. That would be a very difficult tier list to make. But still, the community can come to a general agreement as to which characters are the strongest, making them top-tier characters. then it becomes expected of a person who seeks to play competitively and get wins to play with one of those top tier characters, because, as I stated before, they're automatically at a disadvantage if they don't, unless their own skill can make up for it. I'm not saying you should pick a top tier if you don't want to. There are occasions where you simply might not like playing any of the top tier characters and you would rather have actual fun playing your usual main, even if they're not as strong. That's fine. Character loyalty is perfectly acceptable, and it denotes a desire to win without being at the mercy of any tier list. Even I have characters I love too much to drop even if they're at the bottom. But you also lose the right to complain when you get beaten by one of those top tier characters, because, at the end of the day, that character is as equally available to you as they are to your opponent, but you've made the active decision to not use them, and that is on you. I've followed the Scrubquote's Twitter account for years, and if fighting games were based around the whining of salty, inexperienced players, then no fighting game ever would have ranged attacks, command grabs, throws, combos longer than 3 hits, or even blocking. Seriously, scrubs even complain about blocking. But there's another aspect that makes fighting games, and other competitive genres, potentially complex or even impenetrable to more casual players: knowledge checks. Almost every single 2D fighting game, like Street Fighter, King of Fighters, and Guilty Gear, has at least one zoner and one grappler. The general game plan of the former is to use mid to long range attacks to keep the opponent well beyond arm's reach, while the latter is meant to get in very close with the hopes of pulling off a powerful command grab, which can melt the opponent's life bar. These two character archetypes are knowledge checks, because while they might not be super powerful characters in the grand scheme of things, particularly at a high level of play, a person who is inexperienced in dealing with them might still have a very difficult time. You need only glance over at the Scrubquote's Twitter account to understand what I mean. Low-level players complain about zoners and grapplers all the damn time, even if those characters might be considered weak overall in their respective games, because they require specific knowledge in how to deal with them. The scrubs in question will always claim that zoning is spammy or cowardly, or that command grabs are overpowered or cheap. It's a very common complaint, but that doesn't make it true. Zoners and grapplers are a core part of the genre, and if a player is competent at multiple characters but picks one that they know the opponent will have a hard time against, that's not cheating. That's simply being pragmatic, and it's the nature of competition. If you care that much about wins and losses, then pick that so-called cheap, no-skill character too, or stop complaining. And then you have Battle Royales. Yes, I'm entering this territory as well. You may wonder what kind of pragmatism I might be prepared to defend here, and it's probably going to be controversial. Camping. I'll keep it very simple. The goal of a Battle Royale match is to be the last one surviving. Everything else comes second. Your kill count ultimately doesn't matter on a game-to-game basis. Yes, the player count still needs to be whittled down, but in a game featuring anywhere from 40 to 100 players, depending on the game you're playing, it's unlikely everyone will be camping. And even if they are, the shrinking play zone will guarantee movement and encounters anyway. In the ideal scenario, the only kill a camper would need in order to win is on the other final player when they're the last two. I know that getting killed from behind when you enter a room is very frustrating, because it's a death you can't really prevent or fight back from. I get it. It's easy to say that you don't consider camping to be a skilled tactic. But in a game mode where there's dozens of players and only one winner, it's just the safest way to play 9 times out of 10. And contrary to popular assumption, it's not a strategy that's completely absent of pressure. If someone chooses one spot to camp in, they need to be hyper aware of all their surroundings in all directions, because the longer a camper stays in one spot, the more likely they are to be discovered and let someone get the drop on them. Yes, for some, it may be the only tactic that really gets them results, because they're simply better at playing the patient game than running and gunning. But if it works, then it works. It's also easy to assume that a camper doesn't have fun with camping, but that's just salty speculation. It's not up to you to decide if a camper has fun camping. Plenty of people do sincerely enjoy taking a slow, defensive strategy in any given game, even in fighting games which I just talked about. The responsibility is not on the camper to simply stop camping, it's on the other players to find and kill them. If a game is truly too rewarding to campers because they get so many good vantage points and skills or perks that make them impossible to detect, then that's something that should be taken up with the developers, not the person who is camping, because at the end of the day, they're just using the resources available to them and the strategy that the game itself allows. If you hate campers, then go play the recently released Rumbleverse. It does a pretty good job at naturally discouraging camping without feeling forceful by simply rewarding aggressive play. And finally, as a bit of a bonus, I want to touch on speedrunning. Yes, I am also entering this territory too. I might as well since I'm on the topic. One thing that isn't really internalized by people who don't fully understand speedrunning, aside from the fact that a serious speedrun attempt is never the speedrunner's first time touching a game, is the approach that is adopted to get the shortest possible time in any percent runs. And any percent speedrun means reaching the end of the game as fast as possible, regardless of how much content is unlocked on the way, and with the utilization of any bugs, skips, or glitches that will help in achieving a shorter time. Anything goes. Some bystanders with no real knowledge of speedrunning might consider this cheating and wonder why it's allowed, but this is the most pragmatic category in speedrunning because it truly takes advantage of anything to accomplish the shortest possible time, because that's the only goal that is sought after in this category. If a strategy or skip or sequence break or glitch can shave off even a single second, then it's likely worth implementing into an any percent run. End of story. However, every game typically also has glitchless speedruns, which means still going through the game as fast as the player can perform, but without using any bugs or exploits. It's often a subcategory with various levels of completion, meaning there can be glitchless any percent runs, glitchless 100% speedruns, and anything in between. So if you truly think using glitches is unfair, then you can watch glitchless runs. Otherwise, there's no point in complaining about glitches being used in normal any percent runs, because that's how the category is meant to be played. In summary, pragmatic playstyles are a core part of gaming, and sometimes they're even actively encouraged by developers themselves. In single-player games, some people love the journey to discovering the most broken tools and builds. It's like a creative process for them. They and others might find the most fulfillment in knowing that they can trivialize the game's toughest challenges and feel ultra-powerful. In multiplayer games, some people seek the strongest weapons or characters and follow the meta because they know it'll help them get wins. That's just the nature of competition, as I've stated multiple times already. Some people just want wins and will use the most advantageous methods to get them, and it's expected that a portion of a player base will be like that. If you were to ask me why I made this video, I guess the most straightforward answer would be, I'm tired of some people expecting others to play by their own arbitrary rules. I find that a lot of anger and frustration aimed at pragmatists stems from these other players creating rules for themselves and staying within their limits, even though the game they're playing never insisted upon such a thing. It's why you see so much mockery aimed at people who use the strongest spells in Souls games, or complaining about zoners in fighting games. People craft their own nonsense house rules and try to use them to dictate everyone else's playstyle. It's annoying. But pragmatists aren't going to be constrained by boundaries that don't actually exist. They'll play however they want and reach their goal as efficiently as the game will allow, and that's fine. Players should be able to get from point A to point B however they wish, and I think developers should allow a little bit of wiggle room on strong builds or tools, because overzealous balancing might end up making the gameplay feel too uniform in spite of all the resources. If I had to pick between one side or the other, I would much rather play a game where everything feels a little bit overpowered than a little bit underpowered. Because while a lot of people might enjoy a challenge, it doesn't necessarily mean they enjoy feeling weak. And that's a very fine line developers walk when balancing their game. This concludes my long-winded discussion on pragmatism in video games. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.